The year was 1922. The Great War had ended just 4 years prior, leaving the world forever changed. Millions had perished in the muddy trenches of Europe, and those who returned were shadows of their former selves, carrying invisible wounds that would never fully heal. The Spanish flu had swept through communities already weakened by war and grief, but humanity, resilient as ever, was beginning to hope again. For many, especially in the small town of Elmwood Grove, nestled between rolling hills and a winding river in upstate New York, life had begun to find its rhythm again. The sound of jazz music drifted through open windows on warm evenings, crackling through newly purchased phonographs that proudly displayed the latest recordings of Louis Armstrong and Jelly Roll Morton. Women were embracing shorter haircuts and dresses that scandalously revealed their ankles, dancing the Charleston at social gatherings, while older generations looked on with a mixture of shock and grudging fascination. Prohibition had driven alcohol underground, but speakeasies flourished behind unmarked doors, where passwords and knowing glances granted entry to rooms filled with bootlegged whiskey and gin. Men returned from battlefields to become bankers, shopkeepers, and farmers once more, though many carried a distant look in their eyes that appeared without warning during quiet moments. Automobiles were becoming more common on streets once dominated by horses and carriages, though the animals still had their place. Electricity had reached most homes in town, though some stubbornly clung to gas lamps and wood stoves. It was a time of transition, of old and new coexisting in sometimes awkward harmony. Among the residents of Elmwood Grove were Thomas and Eleanor Blackwood. They were the kind of couple that seemed destined for each other, the sort that made others believe in fate and true love. You could see it in the way they looked at each other across crowded rooms, in the gentle touch of his hand at the small of her back as they walked down Main Street after Sunday service, in the private smiles they shared over inside jokes no one else understood. Thomas, with his impeccable suits and carefully pomaded hair, had returned from France with a slight limp and nightmares he never spoke of. At 32, he had established himself as a promising accountant at Elmwood National Bank, where his meticulous nature and gift for numbers had earned him a reputation for reliability and discretion. His colleagues respected him, his superiors valued him, and the townspeople greeted him warmly as he made his daily walk to and from the imposing stone building in the town square. Eleanor, 2 years younger with her bobbed chestnut hair and bright, intelligent eyes, taught piano at the local school and volunteered at the First Presbyterian Church on Sundays, where her clear soprano voice led the choir. She had a gift for making people feel at ease, for drawing out shy children and encouraging their musical talents, for remembering the small details of others' lives that made them feel seen and valued. Her students adored her, the church ladies admired her, and even the town gossips could find little to criticize about Eleanor Blackwood. They had met at a church social in 1919, shortly after Thomas's return from the war. Eleanor, playing the piano for the gathering, had noticed the handsome, serious man standing alone by the punch bowl, his eyes fixed on some distant point only he could see. Later, she would tell friends that something in his solitude had called to her, had made her want to bring him back to the present, to remind him that there was still beauty and joy to be found in the world. She had approached him, offered him a cup of punch, and asked about his favorite music. Their conversation had flowed easily, surprisingly, as if they had known each other for years rather than minutes. By the end of the evening, Thomas was smiling, a real smile that reached his eyes, for the first time since before the war. 3 months later, he proposed. 6 months after that, they were married in the same church where they had met, with half the town in attendance. They lived in a modest but charming house on Sycamore Street, a 2-story clapboard structure painted a cheerful yellow with white trim, white picket fence surrounding a small front yard where Eleanor had planted roses and hydrangeas, garden in the back where she grew vegetables and more flowers, spending hours with her hands in the soil while Thomas read the newspaper on a bench nearby, occasionally reading interesting passages aloud to her. A front porch where Thomas would smoke his pipe in the evenings, nodding at passers-by, sometimes engaging neighbors in conversations about town affairs or national politics. Inside, their home was warm and inviting. Eleanor's piano took pride of place in the parlor, where she would play in the evenings while Thomas sat in his favorite armchair, sometimes humming along, sometimes just watching her with evident adoration. Photographs of their wedding day, their families, their trips to nearby Lake George adorned the walls and mantelpiece. Books filled shelves that Thomas had built himself, everything from poetry to history to the latest novels. The kitchen always smelled of something delicious, Eleanor's apple pies were legendary in the neighborhood, and she often sent Thomas to work with extra slices to share with his colleagues. They were respected, admired even. The perfect couple in a postcard-perfect town. They attended church regularly, paid their bills promptly, participated in community events, and were unfailingly kind to everyone they met. If they had any private sorrows, perhaps disappointment at not yet having children after 3 years of marriage, perhaps lingering trauma from Thomas's war experiences, they kept them behind the closed doors of their yellow house on Sycamore Street until they weren't there anymore. On the morning of September 17, 1922, Martha Winters, Eleanor's closest friend since childhood, arrived at the Blackwood home for their weekly quilting session. The sun was shining, birds were singing in the maple tree by the porch, and Martha hummed a popular tune as she climbed the 3 steps to the front door, a basket of fabric scraps over her arm. She knocked, waited, then knocked again. Receiving no answer, she tried the handle and found the door unlocked. Unusual, but not alarming. Perhaps Eleanor was in the garden and hadn't heard her knock. "Eleanor," Martha called as she stepped into the front hall, the familiar scent of lemon polish and Eleanor's rosewater perfume greeting her. "It's Martha. Are you home, dear?" No response met her calls. The house was silent in a way that felt immediately wrong to Martha, though she couldn't have explained why. She moved through the parlor, noting the piano with its cover down. Sheet music neatly stacked, nothing out of place. The kitchen revealed more puzzling details. The kettle was cold on the stove. 2 teacups sat on the kitchen table, empty and dry, as if prepared for tea that was never served. The icebox contained fresh milk and eggs. A loaf of bread, only a day old, sat on the counter beneath a cloth. Martha's unease grew as she climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor. The bedroom door stood open. The bed was made with hospital corners, the way Eleanor had learned from her mother. Thomas's shaving kit was missing from the washstand, but his razor strop still hung on its hook. The wardrobe revealed several empty hangers where clothes should have been, but many garments remained, organized by color as Eleanor preferred. A drawer in the dresser was partially open, as if items had been hastily removed. Back downstairs, Martha noticed what she had missed in her initial confusion. Thomas's favorite hat and coat were missing from the hook by the door, as was Eleanor's blue wool coat and matching cloche hat, her preferred ensemble for travel. The leather suitcase they had received as a wedding gift was not in its usual place in the hall closet, and most tellingly, their automobile, a black Ford Model T that Thomas had saved 3 years to purchase, was gone from the small garage behind the house. At first, no one worried too much. Perhaps they had been called away suddenly, a sick relative, an unexpected opportunity. The Blackwoods had family in Buffalo and Albany. Maybe they had received an urgent telegram requiring immediate departure. It would explain the teacups prepared but unused, the hastily packed clothes, the absence of their automobile. Surely they would send word soon, explaining their abrupt departure. But days passed, then weeks. No telegram arrived explaining their absence. No telephone call to their neighbors. No letter to the bank where Thomas's desk remained untouched, his meticulous ledgers closed, his fountain pen laid precisely parallel to the edge of the blotter, just as he had left it. Their accounts at the bank remained undisturbed, neither deposits nor withdrawals recorded after September 16th. The postmaster reported no change of address request, and letters from distant friends and subscription magazines began to pile up, unclaimed. The local police chief, William Donovan, a gruff, practical man who had served the town for 15 years, conducted what he called a thorough investigation. He interviewed neighbors, colleagues, church members, students, anyone who might have information about the Blackwoods' plans or problems. He examined their home, their financial records, their correspondence. He sent telegrams to police departments in nearby cities and towns, inquiring about sightings of the couple or their distinctive black Model T. He found nothing suspicious, no signs of struggle in the house, no evidence of foul play, no unexpected withdrawals from their bank account, no quarrels reported with neighbors or colleagues, no indications of ill health or mental distress, no hints of secret vices or hidden troubles, just absence. Where the Blackwoods had been, there was now only silence and speculation. Some said they had run away to start a new life somewhere exciting, perhaps Chicago or New York City, drawn by the bright lights and opportunities of the metropolis. Others whispered about debts or professional disgrace, though Thomas's position at the bank and the couple's modest but comfortable lifestyle made this seem unlikely. The more imaginative suggested kidnapping, murder, or even more fantastical fates: abduction by criminals, secret government work, amnesia following an accident. Rumors multiplied and transformed with each retelling. They had joined a traveling circus. They had fled to Canada to escape mysterious enemies. They had been murdered by bootleggers who had mistaken them for federal agents. They had abandoned their identities to infiltrate a criminal organization. They had run away to Hollywood to become moving picture stars. By Christmas of 1922, the talk had largely died down. Other news and gossip had taken precedence. The engagement of the mayor's daughter to a questionable young man from the next town over, the scandalous new hemlines being worn by young women at holiday parties, the proposed new streetlights for Main Street that some felt were an unnecessary expense. The Blackwood house remained empty, gathering dust, a silent monument to the mystery. Eventually, distant relatives, a cousin of Thomas's from Rochester, sold the property. New families moved in, lived their lives, moved on. The disappearance of Thomas and Eleanor Blackwood became just another tale told by old-timers at the barber shop or over bridge games. A local legend, a ghost story without ghosts. Until 2002, when a young woman named Melissa Carter inherited a house from her great-aunt Judith on the other side of town. Melissa was a freelance photographer who had been living in Boston for the past decade. At 32, she had established a decent career shooting for magazines and corporate clients, and had begun to make a name for herself with a series on abandoned urban spaces that had been exhibited in several small galleries. She had a good eye for composition, for finding beauty in decay, for capturing moments of transition and transformation. Her work was respected if not yet famous, her income adequate if not luxurious, her life busy and largely satisfying. The inheritance came at a crossroads in her life. A relationship with a fellow photographer had just ended after 3 years. Her apartment lease was up for renewal, and a vague restlessness had begun to creep into her days, a sense that perhaps it was time for a change of scene, a new direction. Something about the small town her mother had left behind decades ago called to her, a pull she couldn't quite articulate but felt deeply nonetheless. So she packed up her life, her cameras and lenses carefully wrapped in protective cases, her darkroom equipment, her books and records, her collection of vintage postcards from places she had never visited, and moved to Elmwood Grove, a place she had visited only a handful of times as a child for brief, awkward holidays with a great-aunt she barely knew. The house on Pine Lane was large, Victorian, and filled with 80 years of her great-aunt Judith's life. 3 stories of dark wood, stained glass windows, ornate moldings, and creaking floorboards. It stood on a corner lot, partially hidden by ancient oak trees, surrounded by a wrought iron fence that had long ago surrendered to ivy. Inside, every surface was covered with objects, books, photographs, curios, collections of thimbles and teacups and hand-carved birds, embroidered pillows and crocheted doilies, glass paperweights and porcelain figurines. Judith Carter had never married, had lived alone in the family home her entire adult life, and had been, by all accounts, a private and somewhat eccentric woman. She was a collector. Melissa's mother had warned her over the phone when the news of the inheritance came. Not quite a hoarder, but well, you'll see. Take your time sorting through everything. There might be some valuable antiques in there, and possibly some family skeletons too, though God knows what. The Carters were never ones for sharing their secrets. What her mother hadn't mentioned was the photographs, hundreds of them. Albums, loose prints, negatives, all meticulously organized and labeled in Judith's precise handwriting. It seemed her great-aunt had been a photography enthusiast long before Melissa was born, had documented the town and its inhabitants through decades of changes, had created a visual archive of Elmwood Grove that rivaled or surpassed the official records at the Historical Society. Melissa was fascinated. As a photographer herself, she appreciated the technical skill evident in many of the images, the careful composition, the attention to light and shadow. But more than that, she was drawn to the story these photographs told, of a town evolving through the 20th century, of fashions and automobiles and architectural styles changing, of faces aging across decades, of celebrations and ordinary moments preserved in silver gelatin. It was on the 3rd day of cleaning, in a bottom drawer of a roll-top desk in the study, that Melissa found it. A leather-bound album unlike the others, older with no label on its cover, slightly smaller in dimension, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. Inside were photographs of Elmwood Grove from the early 20th century. Street scenes, community picnics, church gatherings, school classes lined up in rows, solemn-faced children in their Sunday best, construction of the town hall, the first automobile to appear on Main Street, and on page 17, a photograph that made Melissa pause. A couple standing in front of a Model T automobile near what appeared to be an old wooden bridge. The man wore a three-piece suit and a fedora tilted at a rakish angle, one hand in his pocket, the other resting possessively on the roof of the car. The woman wore a drop-waist dress with delicate embroidery at the collar, her hair in a fashionable bob, a small clutch purse held in gloved hands. They were smiling for the camera, but there was something in their eyes, a wariness perhaps, or a secret, a tension that belied their relaxed postures and casual elegance. Melissa turned the photograph over carefully. On the back, in faded ink, was written, Thomas and Eleanor Blackwood, September 16th, 1922. The day before. The day before what? Melissa wondered. That evening, over dinner at the local diner, which had been operating since 1910 and prided itself on its unchanged recipe for apple pie, Melissa mentioned the photograph to her waitress, an older woman named Dorothy, who had lived in Elmwood Grove her entire life, and who had taken Melissa under her wing from the moment she had arrived, providing unsolicited but welcome advice about everything from which plumber to call for the inevitable Victorian house emergencies, to which neighbors might be interested in joining a book club. Dorothy's hand froze in the act of refilling Melissa's coffee cup. "The Blackwoods?" she said, the coffee pot hovering dangerously. "Where did you find a photograph of the Blackwoods?" And so Melissa learned about the couple who had vanished without a trace 80 years earlier, and about the mystery that had never been solved. Dorothy, it turned out, was a font of local history, having heard the story from her own grandmother, who had been a contemporary of the missing couple. "They were the talk of the town for months," Dorothy said, sliding into the booth across from Melissa, coffee pot forgotten on the table. "My grandmother said Eleanor Blackwood was the sweetest thing, always had a kind word for everyone. And Thomas was a real gentleman, the sort who'd tip his hat to ladies and help old missus. Pembroke with her groceries. They seemed like the perfect couple. Then one day, poof, gone without a trace. But the strangest part," Dorothy continued, leaning in conspiratorially, her voice dropping to a near whisper, though the diner was nearly empty at this late hour, "is that your great-aunt Judith was only 10 years old when they disappeared. She lived on the other side of town. The Blackwoods wouldn't have had any reason to know her, let alone give her one of the last photographs taken of them." Melissa felt a chill run down her spine despite the warmth of the diner and the hot coffee in her hands. "How do you know it was one of the last?" "Because," Dorothy said, her eyes wide with the drama of it all, "September 16th, 1922 was the day before they vanished. No one ever saw them again after that day. No one knew what happened to them. It was as if they'd been plucked right off the face of the earth." That night, Melissa couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the photograph, about the couple who had smiled for the camera and then stepped out of existence, about her great-aunt who had kept their image hidden away for decades. What was the connection? How had a 10-year-old girl come to possess such a significant historical artifact? And what had happened to Thomas and Eleanor Blackwood on that September day 80 years ago? The next morning, she visited the local historical society, housed in what had once been the town hall, a grand brick building with white columns and a clock tower that had kept time for Elmwood Grove since 1895. The volunteer on duty, a retired history teacher named Harold Fisher, was delighted to have someone interested in local history and quickly produced folders of newspaper clippings, police reports, and photographs related to the Blackwood disappearance. "It's one of our great unsolved mysteries," he said, his eyes bright behind thick glasses. "Right up there with Judge Hollister's missing pocket watch and the ghost of the old mill. We get a few amateur sleuths in here every year, thinking they'll crack the case. No one ever has." Melissa spent hours poring over yellowed newsprint and faded photographs. The story was largely as Dorothy had told it. A respected couple, no signs of trouble, gone without explanation. The police investigation had turned up nothing. The Model T had never been found. No bodies had ever been discovered. No sightings had been confirmed, despite reported glimpses of the couple in cities as far-flung as Chicago, San Francisco, and even Paris. But in one of the articles, dated October 3, 1922, there was a mention that caught Melissa's eye. Police Chief Donovan has dismissed rumors of the Blackwoods' connection to the Carter banking scandal as irrelevant to the investigation. The Carter banking scandal, Melissa's family name. Further digging revealed that in early 1922, a banker named Jonathan Carter had been accused of embezzlement from Elmwood National Bank, where he had served as president for nearly 20 years. He had maintained his innocence, but had died of a heart attack before the case went to trial. The charges had been dropped, the money never recovered, and the matter had faded from public memory in the wake of other, more sensational news. Jonathan Carter had been Judith's father, Melissa's great-grandfather. The connection was tenuous at best, but it was something. Melissa returned to the house on Pine Lane with more questions than answers, her mind racing with possibilities. Had her great-grandfather known something about the Blackwoods' disappearance? Had her great-aunt? Was there more to the story than a simple, if mysterious, departure? She spent the evening examining the photograph again, looking for clues she might have missed. The couple, the car, the bridge, which she now recognized from historical society photographs as the old covered bridge at the edge of town, torn down in the 1950s and replaced by a modern concrete structure. The date, September 16, 1922, the day before they vanished. And then she noticed something odd. In the background, partially hidden by the edge of the Model T, was another figure, someone watching from the shadows of the bridge. It was blurry, hard to make out, but Melissa was certain it was there, a witness to this moment frozen in time. Using her professional equipment, she scanned the photograph at high resolution and enhanced the shadowy area as best she could. The figure remained indistinct, but she could now see it was a young girl in a pinafore dress, her hair in braids, her face a pale smudge in the darkness of the bridge entrance. A girl who would have been about 10 years old in 1922. Could it have been Judith? The next day, Melissa returned to the Historical Society with new purpose. Harold helped her locate school photographs from 1922, and there, in a class picture from Elmwood Grove Elementary, was a solemn-faced little girl identified as Judith Carter. The image was small and not particularly clear, but the resemblance to the figure in the Blackwood photograph was striking. The same posture, the same hairstyle, the same pinafore dress that seemed to have been the uniform of young girls in that era. It was impossible to tell with absolute certainty if she was the same child from the background of the Blackwood photograph, but it was another thread in the increasingly complex tapestry Melissa was uncovering. She expanded her search, looking through town records, old maps, anything that might help her understand the connection between her great-aunt and the vanished couple. In the process, she learned that the Blackwoods' house on Sycamore Street was just a short walk from the covered bridge where the photograph had been taken, and that Jonathan Carter, before his disgrace, had been on the board of directors at the same bank where Thomas Blackwood had worked as an accountant. The pieces were starting to form a pattern, but the picture was still unclear. Back at the house, Melissa continued her methodical sorting of Judith's belongings. She found more photographs, more collections, more evidence of a life spent accumulating and preserving memories and objects, but nothing else directly related to the Blackwoods. Nothing that explained the connection or the disappearance. In the attic, she found trunks of old clothes, holiday decorations, school memorabilia, the normal accumulation of a long life. But behind a stack of hat boxes, she discovered a small wooden chest, locked, with no key in sight. It was made of dark, polished wood, with brass corners, and a small, intricate lock that appeared to be handcrafted rather than mass-produced. It took a trip to the hardware store and some careful work with a set of picks, a skill Melissa had learned from a locksmith boyfriend in college, years before, but eventually she managed to open the chest. Inside were journals, dozens of them, spanning from 1922 to just months before Judith's death, each labeled with the year in that same precise handwriting that had annotated the photographs. Melissa started with the earliest volume, dated September 1922. The handwriting was childish, the entries brief and often concerned with schoolyard dramas and family meals. But on September 16th, the entry read, "Saw Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood at the bridge today. They didn't see me. They were having their picture taken by a man I didn't know. Mrs. Blackwood was crying when they thought no one was looking. Mr. Blackwood kept checking his pocket watch and looking up and down the road. They had suitcases in their automobile. I think they're going away. I wanted to say hello because Mrs. Blackwood always gives me a peppermint when I see her at church, but Father says I mustn't speak to Mr. Blackwood anymore. He says Mr. Blackwood is asking too many questions at the bank. I don't understand what that means." The next day's entry was even more intriguing. Father was gone all night. Mother was very upset, pacing and looking out the window. When he came home this morning, his clothes were dirty and he looked very tired. He went straight upstairs to wash and change. I heard the water running for a long time. At breakfast, I asked if he had seen Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, since I saw them yesterday at the bridge and thought maybe they had visited our house. Father got very angry. His face turned red and he slammed his hand on the table so hard the dishes jumped. He said, "Mr. Blackwood has gone away and isn't coming back. He says I mustn't tell anyone about seeing them yesterday." He was very angry when I mentioned it at breakfast. Mother sent me to my room without supper for eavesdropping, but I heard them talking later. Father said, "It's done. They won't be a problem anymore." What did he mean? And why was there dirt under his fingernails at breakfast? Father is always so clean. He says dirty fingernails are a sign of a careless man. Melissa's heart raced as she read. Could her great-grandfather have had something to do with the Blackwoods' disappearance? The banking scandal, Thomas Blackwood's position at the bank, the timing. It all suggested a connection more sinister than she had initially imagined. She read on through the journals, following Judith's life as she grew from a curious child to a thoughtful teenager, a dedicated student, a young woman caring for aging parents. Jonathan Carter died in 1935. His reputation never fully recovered from the banking scandal, though he had never been convicted. Judith's mother passed in 1942. Judith inherited the house and lived there alone, working as a librarian at the town library until her retirement in the 1970s. Throughout the journals, there were occasional references to the Blackwoods, newspaper articles about the unsolved mystery, town anniversaries when the case was mentioned, Judith's own reflections on that day at the bridge, but nothing that explained how she had come to possess the photograph or what had really happened to the couple. Until Melissa reached the journal from 1972, 50 years after the disappearance. The entry for September 16th of that year read, "I visited their graves today, as I do every year on this date. No one knows they're there, of course. No marker, no record. Just two souls laid to rest beneath the old oak at the far corner of the property." Father always said it was necessary, that Thomas Blackwood would have ruined him, would have ruined all of us, that the money was rightfully his compensation for years of being underpaid and underappreciated. I'm not sure I believe that anymore. I haven't believed it for a long time. I took flowers, roses for Eleanor, who once told me they were her favorite when I delivered library books to their home. She was always kind to me. I don't think she knew what her husband had discovered about Father's activities at the bank. I don't think she deserved what happened to her. I still remember that day so clearly, hiding behind the bridge support, watching them pose for the photograph that the private investigator was taking. Father had hired him to document their departure, to have proof they had left town voluntarily. Later, when I found the photograph among Father's things after his death, I kept it. A reminder, perhaps, of the moment before everything changed. They never saw me watching, just as they never saw Father following them home afterward. I didn't witness what happened in their house that night. I only know what Father told me years later, when he was dying and needed to unburden his soul to someone. How Thomas had confronted him about the missing funds. How there had been an argument, a struggle. How Eleanor had tried to intervene and fallen, hitting her head on the fireplace. How Thomas had attacked him in grief and rage, forcing Father to defend himself with the fireplace poker. 2 accidental deaths, he called them. Tragic but unavoidable. He had protected himself, protected our family name, protected me. He buried them on our property that night, drove their car to the train station in the next town, and created the illusion that they had simply left. I've kept the secret all these years. What good would revealing it do now? Father is long gone. Justice, if there could ever be such a thing for the Blackwoods, is impossible. All I can offer them is this annual pilgrimage, these flowers, my regret. Melissa sat in the gathering darkness of the attic, the journal open in her lap, tears streaming down her face. She had come looking for a connection to her family, for a new beginning in this small town. Instead, she had uncovered a terrible secret that had been buried for 80 years. What should she do with this knowledge? The logical part of her brain cataloged the possibilities. Go to the police, find the graves, give Thomas and Eleanor Blackwood a proper burial, a marked resting place. Expose her great-grandfather as a murderer. But what would that accomplish now, when everyone involved was long dead? Would it bring justice or just more pain? Would it honor the Blackwoods or merely sensationalize their tragedy? She thought about the photograph, about the smiling couple standing in front of their car, unaware that they had less than 24 hours to live. About the little girl watching from the shadows, who would grow up carrying the weight of a secret she hadn't chosen. About her great-grandfather, whose actions had rippled through decades, affecting lives he had never even known would exist, including her own. In the days that followed, Melissa continued to read through Judith's journals, hoping for more information about the Blackwoods. The annual cemetery visits continued until Judith became too frail in her final years. There were mentions of nightmares, of guilt, of a lifetime spent in the shadow of her father's actions. From the journals, Melissa pieced together more of the story. Thomas Blackwood, it seemed, had discovered irregularities in the bank's accounts during a routine audit. He had traced the discrepancies to Jonathan Carter, finding evidence of systematic embezzlement over a period of years. Rather than reporting his findings immediately, Thomas had confronted Carter directly, perhaps hoping to give his superior a chance to explain or make amends. It had been a fatal mistake. On the day of the photograph, September 16, 1922, the Blackwoods had been planning to leave town, not as a permanent departure, but to visit the State Banking Commission in Albany, where Thomas intended to present his evidence. The private investigator had been hired by Carter to document their departure, to establish the narrative that they had left voluntarily when questions about their absence inevitably arose. That night, Carter had followed them home and confronted them. The confrontation had turned violent, resulting in the deaths that he later described to his daughter as accidental. Whether they were truly accidental or deliberate murders was a question Melissa would never be able to answer with certainty. And there was one more revelation. In a journal from 1988, I found something today, while going through Mother's old jewelry box, a locket I had never seen before, with the initials EB engraved on it. Inside was a tiny photograph of Thomas and a lock of dark hair. I can only assume it belonged to Eleanor Blackwood, that Father took it from their house that night as some kind of trophy. The thought makes me ill. I should dispose of it, but somehow I cannot. It feels wrong to discard this last piece of her. Instead, I've placed it in the box with the photograph. Perhaps someday someone will find them and understand. Melissa returned to the leather album containing the Blackwood photograph. She examined it carefully, page by page, until she found what she was looking for. A small pocket in the back cover, the kind sometimes included in old albums for storing negatives or special mementos. Inside was a silver locket, tarnished with age. The initials EB were barely visible on its surface. When she carefully opened it, she found a faded image of Thomas Blackwood and a curl of dark hair. A physical connection to the woman who had died 80 years ago, whose body lay in an unmarked grave behind the house Melissa now owned. That night she made her decision. The next morning, she went to the police station and asked to speak with the chief. The current chief, a woman named Sarah Donovan, great-granddaughter of the chief who had investigated the original disappearance, listened gravely to Melissa's story. She examined the journals, the photograph, the locket. "This is extraordinary," Chief Donovan said finally, closing the journal from 1972 and looking up at Melissa with a mixture of professional interest and human empathy. "But you understand, this is essentially a deathbed confession written down by a witness who was a child at the time. Corroborating evidence after 80 years will be challenging at best." "I know where they're buried," Melissa said quietly. "If you find their remains, if you can identify them somehow, DNA testing might be possible if we can locate any descendants for comparison," the chief said, already thinking like a professional. "And dental records from that era sometimes survived. It's worth investigating." The next days were a blur of activity. Melissa signed forms granting permission for the police to search the property. She answered questions from detectives who specialized in cold cases. She provided copies of the journals and the photograph. She weathered the curious glances and whispered conversations when she ventured into town for groceries or coffee. 2 days later, a small team of police officers and forensic specialists arrived at the house on Pine Lane. Using ground-penetrating radar, they identified an anomaly beneath the ancient oak tree at the far corner of the property. Careful excavation revealed 2 sets of human remains, buried side by side at a depth of approximately 6 feet. The female skeleton wore a silver bracelet engraved with the name Eleanor. The male had a pocket watch in the remnants of his waistcoat, the chain still threaded through a buttonhole. Inside the case was inscribed, "To Thomas, all my love, Eleanor." Further examination revealed a fracture to the back of the female skull, consistent with a fall against a hard surface like a fireplace. The male skeleton showed evidence of blunt force trauma to the left temple. the kind of injury that might be caused by a fireplace poker wielded with significant force. Dental records confirmed their identities. Thomas and Eleanor Blackwood had never left Elmwood Grove. They had been there all along, through generations of town life continuing above them, through wars and peace, prosperity and hardship, lying together beneath the spreading branches of the oak. The story made national news. 80-year-old mystery solved, the headlines declared. Depression-era banker's dark secret revealed by granddaughter. Murder and embezzlement in small-town America. Justice after 8 decades. Reporters descended on Elmwood Grove, interviewing elderly residents who barely remembered the original disappearance, filming outside the house on Pine Lane, reconstructing the events of that September night in 1922 with varying degrees of accuracy and sensationalism. Melissa gave one interview, then retreated from the publicity. She had not come forward for fame or attention. She had done it because Thomas and Eleanor Blackwood deserved to be found, to be remembered, to have their story told. In October of 2002, Thomas and Eleanor Blackwood were reburied in the Elmwood Grove Cemetery with a proper headstone. The service was attended by the few distant relatives who could be located, by town officials, by curious citizens, and by Melissa Carter, who placed 2 items in Eleanor's coffin before it was closed: the silver locket and the photograph from the bridge, the last image of the Blackwoods in life. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed, an elderly man approached Melissa. He walked with a cane and was accompanied by a middle-aged woman who held his arm supportively. "Miss Carter?" he said, his voice wavering slightly with age but still strong. "I'm Robert Jenkins. This is my daughter, Patricia. I wanted to thank you for what you've done." Melissa looked at him questioningly. "Eleanor Blackwood was my mother's older sister," he explained. "I never knew her. I wasn't born until 1927, but my mother spoke of her often. She never believed that Eleanor would have left without saying goodbye. She spent years writing to police departments and private detectives, trying to find out what had happened. She died still wondering." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a faded photograph. It showed the same couple from Melissa's discovered photo, but in this image they were at a garden party, laughing, surrounded by friends. "This is how I want to remember them," he said. "Not as victims, but as they were in life, happy, in love. My mother said they were the kind of couple that made you believe in soulmates." Melissa felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm so sorry for what my great-grandfather did," she said. Robert Jenkins shook his head. "You are not responsible for his actions, but you are responsible for bringing them home, for giving my family closure after all these years. We can never repay that debt." As they parted ways, Melissa felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had uncovered a dark chapter in her family's history, had exposed a crime long hidden, but she had also brought truth to light, had restored identities to 2 people who had been erased, had provided answers to those who had spent decades wondering. She returned to the house on Pine Lane, her house now, though she wasn't sure if she would stay. There was something cathartic about sorting through Judith's belongings now, knowing the full story behind the collection of photographs and journals. Her great-aunt had been both keeper of a terrible secret and its reluctant chronicler. Without Judith's detailed documentation, Thomas and Eleanor might never have been found. That evening, as the sun set over Elmwood Grove, painting the Victorian gables with golden light, Melissa sat on the porch with a glass of wine and Judith's final journal open on her lap. The last entry, dated just weeks before her death, read, "I've lived my entire life in the shadow of what happened that night in 1922. I was too young, too afraid to speak up then, too loyal to my father to betray him later. By the time I fully understood the weight of what I was carrying, it seemed too late to unburden myself without destroying what remained of our family name. But I've prepared for the truth to emerge after I'm gone. The journals, the photograph, the locket, breadcrumbs leading to a truth I couldn't speak in life. Perhaps it's cowardice to arrange for confession only after death, or perhaps it's my final act of courage. Thomas and Eleanor Blackwood deserved better than unmarked graves and forgotten lives. They deserved to be found, to be remembered, to have their story told. And so I leave this task to whoever finds what I have hidden in plain sight. May they have the strength to bring to light what I kept in darkness for too long. May they understand that some secrets are too heavy to carry alone through a lifetime. And may Thomas and Eleanor finally rest in peace." Melissa closed the journal gently. In uncovering one mystery, she had glimpsed another, the complex inner life of the great-aunt she had never really known. Judith Carter had not been simply an eccentric recluse. but a woman who had spent 80 years wrestling with a terrible knowledge, who had found her own way to ensure that justice, however delayed, would eventually be served. Tomorrow, Melissa would continue sorting through the house, deciding what to keep, what to donate, what to discard. She would begin making plans for her future in or beyond Elmwood Grove. She would take another step in her own story. But tonight, she sat in the gathering darkness, raising her glass in a silent toast to Thomas and Eleanor Blackwood, finally at rest after 80 years, and to Judith Carter, who had ensured they would eventually be found. In the weeks that followed, Melissa found herself drawn deeper into the history of Elmwood Grove and its inhabitants. The resolution of the Blackwood case had opened doors, had made her something of a local celebrity despite her attempts to avoid the spotlight. Elderly residents sought her out to share memories and stories. The Historical Society invited her to curate an exhibition of Judith's photographs. The local newspaper asked her to write a series of articles about the town's past. She found herself accepting these invitations, becoming part of the community in a way she hadn't anticipated. Her professional eye for composition and detail, combined with her newfound connection to the town's history, gave her a unique perspective that others appreciated and valued. And there were other discoveries in the house on Pine Lane. Behind a loose brick in the basement, she found a small metal box containing the missing funds from the bank, nearly $50,000 in old bills and bonds, a fortune in 1922. Judith had apparently found it after her father's death, but had never spent it, perhaps seeing it as blood money. Melissa donated it to the town for a scholarship fund in Thomas and Eleanor Blackwood's names. In the garden, beneath decades of overgrowth, she uncovered Eleanor's rose bushes, somehow transported from the Blackwood home on Sycamore Street and replanted here, perhaps as another act of penance by Jonathan Carter or a memorial by his daughter. With care and patience, Melissa restored them, and they bloomed again, fragrant and beautiful, their existence another link to the past. She found herself staying in Elmwood Grove, renovating the old house, establishing a photography studio in what had been Judith's parlor. She began documenting the town as her great-aunt had done, creating a contemporary visual record to complement the historical one. She dated occasionally, the high school art teacher, a widowed architect from the next town over, but felt no rush to commit, content with her work and the community she was building around herself. On the first anniversary of the Blackwoods' reburial, she visited their grave, placing roses on the headstone. As she stood there in the autumn sunshine, she felt a sense of completion, of chapters closing and opening simultaneously. The mystery of the Blackwoods had been solved. The secret that had haunted her family for generations had been revealed. But the story, her story, was just beginning. In the gentle breeze that rustled the cemetery's maple trees, she could almost hear the whispers of those who had come before, Thomas and Eleanor, whose lives had been cut short. Judith, who had carried the burden of knowledge for so long, all the others who had played their parts in this drama spanning 8 decades. Their whispers seemed to say, "Remember us, tell our story, and then live your own." And so she would. Sometimes, Melissa thought as she walked back toward Pine Lane, the most important stories are the ones that take the longest to tell. Sometimes the truth waits patiently, preserved in photographs and journals, in lockets and pocket watches, in memories and whispers, until the right moment and the right person comes along to bring it into the light. And sometimes justice arrives, not with the swift stroke of law, but with the gentle persistence of memory, with the quiet determination to uncover what has been hidden, to name what has been forgotten, to honor what has been lost. As she reached the gate of the old Carter house, her house now, she paused to look up at its Victorian towers and gables, at the windows that had witnessed so much over the past century. The afternoon sun glinted off the stained glass, creating patterns of colored light on the wraparound porch. The ancient oak tree at the corner of the property, no longer a secret grave but simply a tree again, swayed slightly in the breeze. In that moment, Melissa felt a profound connection to this place and its stories, not just the dramatic tale of the Blackwoods, but all the quieter stories that had unfolded within these walls and throughout this town. The ordinary lives that, when examined closely enough, revealed themselves to be extraordinary in their complexity and humanity. She would continue to document these stories through her photography, would continue to explore the past while living fully in the present, would continue to remember while also creating new memories, would honor those who had come before while forging her own path forward. And perhaps, someday, someone would find her photographs and tell her story, continuing the cycle of revelation and remembrance that connected all human lives across time. For now, though, she was content to be the finder rather than the found, the teller rather than the told, the one who had brought light to long-buried secrets and, in doing so, had discovered her own place in the ongoing narrative of Elmwood Grove. As she climbed the steps to the porch, keys in hand, Melissa smiled at the thought that sometimes the greatest mysteries are not those that remain unsolved, but those that reveal themselves slowly, layer by layer, across years and generations, connecting past and present in unexpected ways. And sometimes the most valuable inheritance is not a house or possessions, but a story waiting to be discovered and shared. She opened the door and stepped inside, ready to continue writing her own chapter in that ever-unfolding story.